Welcome to this podcast episode with Tim Wendelboe. I'm really excited that you would like to join this weird conversation. Um, I've had a few who are willing to go into these kinds of discussions, but not too many actually.
Okay.
It might be because it's both a bit strange and controversial to see the scientific method from that perspective, which I actually think is the correct perspective.
Yeah.
Science is kind of used in so many different. Everybody wants science to back up what they are saying, right? So, but few really want to spend time understanding what science is, and then I think there's a much bigger gap between those two than people are typically aware of in the community. So I'm really excited that you are willing to go into this route, Tim. So basically, I created this podcast series because I think there's this big discrepancy, and I wanted to point this discrepancy out for the not to be kind of pictured as the hero myself at all, but actually because I think we're wasting so much time in the community with this confusion.
Yeah.
So I really feel very strong for this because I feel that we are wasting a lot of time, and that makes us weak. And wasting less time is something everybody wants to do, right? And I think I have an important message here. That's what I think. And I would like to hear people I respect, such as you, how this my approach is perceived and how you see it's relevant, and also the weaknesses in my thoughts and where they could be better. So I've invited you to kind of come up with three criticisms and three things where you felt that my perspective was really onto something, and you can start with the critical or positive in whichever sequence you want, and it doesn't need to be three, it could be more or less whatever you feel like. So welcome, Tim, and
Thank you.
actually now I'll just give you the word.
All right. Well, I've listened to the podcast, which I found very interesting. Of course, for an uneducated man as myself, it's sometimes a bit overwhelming because although I found the principles to be quite simple and very simply explained, there's a lot of things you need to kind of work your head around, which can be quite foreign to people, I think, in general. But because I have a lot of experience in coffee and have done a lot of experiments over the time, I also recognized a lot of the methodology you were talking about, and also could kind of quite easily remember experiments that I've done that I made conclusions from that when I look back at it now, and especially after hearing your podcast, I can totally falsify the findings I had because I did not control every element of the experiment, and I didn't necessarily use the right method of measuring. So I think, from my perspective, it's only positive. I don't really have any negative insights into this podcast at all, because I think it's only positive to provoke people to think what they're actually doing and rethink their methods and what they're doing in order to kind of educate and find things that they're teaching to other people. I'm a coffee teacher myself. Like, I've been teaching coffee for many years, and I think I know for a fact that a lot of things that I've said in the past is not correct because it has later been proven to be wrong. But it didn't mean that it was wrong when I said it, because that's what we thought until something new was discovered. So I think it's always unpleasant for people to be told that they're not necessarily doing things right, especially if they've been doing it the same way for many, many years.
Yeah, and that I've tried that a lot as well, and I'm also ready for this to happen several times again. And that's of course uncomfortable, but it's also an uncomfortability that good teachers are accepting and taking seriously. Just to go back a bit, so you said that you didn't feel that there was something that you wanted to criticize directly. One of the things that I was fearing most as a kind of negative perception of it was that um, at least from an idealistic perspective, I have this picture of business practices and science working together as a collaboration. And one of the things, sometimes I remember this 15 years ago, there was a English, uh, they call it scientific gastronomy or molecular gastronomy or something like that, Peter Barham. And it was interesting, but he was kind of telling the chefs what they did wrong. He
Yeah.
was kind of obsessed about what people did wrong and that science was right, and they just had to kind of follow. And I didn't like that approach. I like the approach that we are working. Well, I'm schizophrenic here because I feel a bit. I have a leg in both worlds,
Yeah.
but I like the
Too many
idea of,
hats.
yeah. Well, I like those two hats, so that's okay. But then there's a lot of other hats that can be a problem. But my point is that I really didn't want it to come out so that it seems like I wanted science to tell the business practices what they should do and kind of be the so I don't know how do you think it doesn't turn out like that, and to which extent do you recognize okay, perhaps there's a bit of that in it?
uh, well, it's a bit hard to say, but I think, a good example. I remember you talked about that as a business, it's very wise to kind of investigate what the customers want in terms of coffee flavor, for instance, and kind of adjust to that in your specific markets. And I am a person who couldn't disagree more with that.
Yeah.
That's kind of a thing that I think maybe where science can say, okay, if you do this, then you will make a product that the customer wants. But in my experience, a lot of times the customer doesn't actually know what they want because they haven't been shown something that is very different. So, for instance, when I opened my own company, we started roasting quite light at that time, and of course, looking back on it now, it was still quite dark and compared to what we're doing today. But we were very different in the markets. Our espresso was high in acidity. It was very fruity. It was not this kind of in Norway back then. All the coffees were like heavy dominated by Indian monsoon Malabar flavors, so very kind of rustic and bitter and earthy flavors. And it pissed a lot of people off. There's an article written by a wine journalist that has the headline "Fuck you, Tim." So pardon my French, but he was so obsessed that I had ruined ruined espresso forever for him and for all Norwegians, because I was pushing this light roast fruity thing. But it turns out there's a lot of people who love that, and they didn't know that until they tried it. So I think it's not always that you will find the correct answer with science, and a lot of times, science is proven wrong after a while as well. And
This is interesting, and I see how I haven't perhaps made it clear, because I definitely understand your point, but I would say this is perhaps not a scientific point as much as it's an educational strategic point, in the sense that it's just because I've been developing the SCA curriculum for a lot of years. And I think from an educational point of view, it's important to provide people with tools so that they can solve any riddle. And with those tools, when you're educated with those tools, then you can meet a business model. And a business model is defined by the vision by the founder. And the vision, if the vision by the founder is to pursue a certain flavor, then that science is not really involved here, saying if that's true or not. So it's more because I see so many opinions be ingrained in the educational system, and I see that there's a lot of missed opportunities for other types of businesses. And for example, if you're told to the curves need to look like this or something like that, and people never talk about the color, then you're missing some tools as a coffee roaster to adapt to a different business model. And here I'm assuming there's no right or wrong business models. There are business models that that are derived from the vision of somebody who's passionate about doing things in a certain way.
Yeah.
And from an educational point of view, I think it's important to have a broad enough kind of toolbox as a going through the education, that it's not assumed that you're going into this or that business model.
Mm.
But once you are kind of, if, for example, I hope that if I educate somebody and they get a job in your business later, there is no kind of nothing from my education that makes people kind of tell you that you are wrong in the way you do it. They are just technicians adapting to your vision, or if
Yeah.
they have their own vision, then they know how to do it, right?
Yeah.
So that's my point. It's more educational than it's scientific, because science has no preferences. Science is just a set of tools to we want to investigate this, and this is how it's done, right?
Yeah.
But I understand, and that's perhaps a place where I could have been a bit more clear about that. Because, and this is interesting because I don't know if this is digression, but I think your business vision and business model is a really interesting one, because it's so risky. and
Yeah.
And that doesn't make it wrong at all, but I think I've been teaching more than 1,500 1,600 individuals in small groups of 6 to 8, and I think more than 80 or 90% of these know who you are, and people kind of see how you do things, and then they want to be Tim Wendelboe.
Yeah.
And what I tell them is, be yourself, everybody else is taken.
Yeah.
And this is where I really want to give them a much bigger picture of what can a coffee roastery be, and who says you actually want to go through all the hassle Tim went through to make a very risky business model work, right? Yeah. And it's, most people are much better off finding their own vision and do what they want, and it could be completely different than Tim Wendelboe, even though everybody knows who you are. Mm. So that's the situation I've been in as an educator, and that's what makes me say things like this. And I think I was thinking about this before this podcast, that as a business idea, I think Tim Wendelboe wasn't a good idea as a business idea. It's only a good idea because you are so passionate and willing to put so much work in for a very long time to make it work.
Yeah.
And to be honest, and it's not to put myself up where you are, but it's a bit the same with Coffee Mind. Imagine a small company with 1.5 people in the beginning, and now 2.5 people doing so much research in an area of the world where people typically don't take education. It's never been a good idea.
Yeah.
Coffee Mind has never been a good idea as an idea, but I just love it so much that I'll just never give up, and then it works. And I think there might be a bit of a similarity there. So I've done a bit of the light roasting kind of risky stuff with education. So that's why I can recognize many of the struggles that people go through starting a roastery at all. I don't know if you think that's a fair kind of.
No, I think you're onto something. Like I do get people asking me for help and like consultancy for when they want to open their own coffee business. And a lot of times they want to kind of open the same as me, like only serve coffee, you know, be in a strange place, not necessarily the high street because the rent is expensive. And if you look at it from a business point of view, that's not sustainable because you need customers and you need to sell, you know. The reason why we chose this role was we were primarily going to roast coffee and sell roasted coffee. So the coffee shop is not really something we make money on. In fact, we actually, in most cases, don't really make money on it at all. So it's not a good business model per se, but I made sure to kind of have a little bit more legs to stand on and diversify my business a little bit to make sure that we could survive, especially in the first years. And of course, now we have built a good portfolio of customers and people who love our coffee. So we're able to survive because of that. But it has taken a lot of work and a lot of years. And
Yeah, because even your wholesale, it's not it wasn't that you were kind of going into a market where it was a sure win, and it has been very
no,
difficult for you to sell something that's so different, right?
yeah,
So
definitely.
so even the wholesale that is your main, I think that only works because you put so much work in doing something that was new, and that only works if you really push for a long time.
Yeah, and I think the dilemma we have with our niche of the coffee industry is that great coffee doesn't sell itself. Like um, the difference between the most prestigious coffees and okay coffees is for a lot of people not so big. They're not able to necessarily describe why this coffee is better than the other. But what, especially with wholesale, what they do look at is the price. So a lot of times they say, we love your coffee, but it's too expensive. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a correlation normally between price and quality, But yeah, so that's kind of the hard part.
But and this is where it's interesting because you have the kind of the features of the coffee, and then you have the branding and the relationship.
mm,
So in a sense, you as a business model, you haven't made it easy for yourself, but you've been able to kind of educate enough people quick enough to make a business because you were really persistent on explaining and educating and
yeah,
because I have this, there's something in industrial design called novelty and familiarity. So that's the balance between the two that is important if you want to win over somebody. If you come with something extremely light to somebody who drinks extremely dark, they've got no idea, right?
mm, mm,
So the closer you go, the more it's familiar, and you can still have an element of novelty. Um, but if there's a big gap, then you need to do a lot of relationship building
yeah.
and work to bridge the gap with other than kind of pure sensory convincing.
Yeah, and this is
Um,
actually part of our strategy. We focus a lot on giving good service to our restaurant clients and really helping them make the process of making coffee a lot easier. So that's our kind of main focus always, to give the best possible service. And because there's a lot of competition in especially in Oslo, with a lot of roasters having fantastic coffee. So the only way for us to kind of add to that is to add service and educate. And I've always been passionate about education, and it's not something that I directly make money on, because I normally give my knowledge out for free in terms of videos and social media. And of course, if we have seminars for professionals, we might charge because it's a lot of organization that needs to be done around it. But I'm a firm believer that the more you educate the public about what you're doing, the more they're going to appreciate what you're doing as well.
yeah.
So it's kind of building the market, and that's why we don't really have a marketing budget, but it's something that's my main job, is to educate.
But it's to educate in the right way, because it's not an easy task to educate people to do something very different than so it's not just to do a lot of education, because you do, do a lot of wrong education. So it's really interesting how you've done it still. um and again, I'm just thinking about, perhaps there's a lot of listeners thinking about, okay, I can do a light roast concept in an otherwise dark roast environment if I just educate. it's
Yeah,
it's it's you can perhaps, and it's risky, but also make sure that that I'd like to remind people about how many different kind of options there are. And again, the whole be yourself, everybody else is taken, that's one of the things that there's a lot of hype in the specialty coffee business, and it's very easy to see the people such as like you and the other big brands and think, I have to model them.
yeah,
But it's never a good idea to model others. You have to find out what your own passions are about, and then derive your business model from there. Otherwise, because that's what you've done, right?
yeah.
And you
This
need
is
the passion, the long-term passion, to succeed with anything.
this is my always been my strategy. Our company and myself, we rarely kind of jump on trends just because it's easy. We can easily sell more product if we just do the latest trend or whatever. But for me, it's always been about selling what I prefer to sell, and buying the coffees that I prefer to drink, roasting it the way I prefer to roast it, because that's the only way you can be consistent over a long time. If you're trying to model everyone else, you're going to jump from maybe 1 year it's very popular to do light roast, and then 5 years later it's very popular to do dark roast, and then your customers are going to be very confused about your
Yeah.
brand. So that's how
Yeah.
we kind of kept consistent over time, because I'm so involved in the product buying and product development in our company. That's been the key for us, I think, for consistency.
It is interesting because I'll just mention a little story, and I'd like to hear your comment on that. I was helping George Karam. I think even you met him perhaps when we went to Nordic Approach to get green coffees. But anyway, he is he's from Paris, and he's started a roastery called Partisan, and he is half Lebanese, or from the Lebanese community in Paris, and he really loved, for example, your coffee. Well, he has got his own personality, so he's not in this copy situation, but he loves light roasted coffee. But he also has a big Lebanese community who loves dark roasted robusta based espresso. So what we did, we created 4 different product ranges. So we created the Lebanese espresso, where we added 30% of the highest quality robusta we could find, and 70% Nordic Approach Arabica, and then that was the Lebanese, and then above that we had the mainstream. That was the latte segment. So that was slightly it was lighter. The dark here was Actron 55. That was way into second crack, and then the mainstream was just up to second crack, so that it tastes enough in latte. And then there was the Explorers above that. That was I think Actron 85 to 90, which was lighter but not really light, for people who started to gain interest in coffee but wasn't ready for the really fruity acidic stuff, but for people who wanted to explore terroir. And then we had the extremely light, an Ethiopian natural, and a Kenyan Actron 120. So he had, when he opened his doors, whoever came in, he could kind of satisfy them. And I think that's another way of keeping your integrity, right? Because he had a plan for everything he did, and he had his own opinion, understood that people had others, but he was able, with his technical approach to coffee roasting, to solve the riddle, right? Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
I mean, especially in a kind of young coffee market, it sounds like a really, really fun way to educate people about coffee flavors, because they can move around from each category there, and you really don't actually need more than one type of coffee almost, and just have different roast also in order to do this exercise. But it sounds like a place that I would love to go myself, and also explore the stuff that I don't normally prefer, because yeah, that sounds like actually a great idea.
Yeah, because that's what I tell people.
Yeah.
I tell people that you have your own preferences, but it's a good idea to think about other, because these steps, I consider them more educational. People think, oh no, if I roast dark, I sell my soul to prophet and the devil. Well, it could also be kind of an educational approach, right? You actually create a product to create a relationship so that you can educate them. But I'm not saying, again, Jim, I'm not saying which business model is the correct one. I'm saying whatever business model you're passionate about is the correct one. And education is very important that education do not paint the students into any corner. Whether that being dark or light. I think it should be pure kind of descriptive and technical, really. And then the whole preference part is the second step of the education. Also, as the short video you saw, where I've kind of divided into control, diversity, and preference in an education model.
I don't know, just to note, we actually did an exercise quite similar to this. It was inspired by the guys at Damoteo in Sweden, but we had, I think it was our 9th anniversary or something, and I made like a blend based on a recipe that's on our first espresso blend, and also kind of roasted it the same way that we did when we started the shop, and then we had that side by side with our kind of new modern espresso. I think this was a couple of years ago, so I don't remember the exact year, but and then we served the kind of old style espresso in a small cup that was preheated and everything, just like we did when we opened the store. And then the other espresso was in a big cup, like the one we're using now, slightly cooled down, and of course different roast, different coffee. It was single origin, and we sold it kind of as a tasting for our customers. We have a lot of regular customers who come in. And the feedback was fantastic. People really loved to be able to taste the development from like 2007 until I think it was 9 years later, and how much progression that we've done. And some people actually really liked the old style coffee as well, and some people hated it. But there's no right or wrong there. It's just there are different ways of doing things. But in our company, I prefer to do it the way I like it to reflect my own taste at any given time. That's kind of the philosophy.
And that authenticity is something that we as coffee people can feel and appreciate. And then me as a consultant and also a coffee owner that struggles a bit myself, I'm just happy that it works for you. and I really appreciate your coffees are amazing. I love them. So it's more like a pure risk assessment of different ideas that people need if they haven't done a business yet. This is something you need to take seriously and not just think that you can do whatever you want, and then just because you want it enough, it's a success. If you want it enough, so you want to work enough, then it can be a success. But it's not just enough to want it enough.
I think in general, in my experience, when people open a business, the most important thing that they should have done, they never do, and that's to write a business plan. To really think about, why am I opening the store, where am I opening it, to whom am I offering the coffee, what should I offer, who are my competitors, what differentiate myself from them. All these things you need to think about before you open the business if you want it to really succeed, because it's so much easier to run the business afterwards when you have answered those questions before you opened.
It's such a good point, Tim. And I will say to the listeners who think, oh, I didn't, then don't worry, it's never too late.
No, exactly.
But particularly after Corona, this is something I've been kind of forced to, which I'm grateful for now, but really think about because when Corona hit, 98% of our customers are or perhaps even 99% of the people coming here on roasting classes are from outside Denmark. And the other business revenue is if I travel. So that's why we've been investing a lot in live studio stuff and live roasting courses, and it's been the most fun I've ever. It works so well. I thought in the beginning it wouldn't work at all. You can't roast on remote, but it works really well. It's almost more fun, and it forces me to be more structured, which has been a good thing for me. So I've actually, I really feel it's amazing. So, but what's the plan, right? You can buy a webcam and hope for the best, but I really had to sit down and think again. So I'm just saying this because if people, most people would start without a plan because they love it and they hope that kind of God will take care of the rest just because you're passionate enough. Your parents typically help you like that, but that doesn't work like that when you grow up. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you feel stuck, it's not too late to just make a business plan from where you are right now. But it's interesting. But Tim, did you do that from the beginning?
I actually spent a year almost to write down the business plan. I stopped working in 2006 and then had like a year off where I did some consultancy and stuff, but that meant a lot of free time. So I was laying on the beach, reading books, planning, writing down, asking all these questions, doing research, and I didn't open until mid 2007. So I still have the business plan, and I actually once a year, more or less, I go back and read through it just to make sure that we're on the right track. and we're still kind of following the principles that are written down there. Very often I get offered to do many different things that can be tempting because of it's good business or something, but I always ask myself, is this actually what we are supposed to do, and is this part of our core business? And if it takes too much distraction away from what I'm supposed to do, then I always say no, because it's better for me to spend my energy building my company rather than, you know, helping someone else build their brand. Okay, it's maybe fast money there and then, but, you know, in the long run, it doesn't benefit the company. I always say no. So a business plan can be really helpful, and it also can make you rethink what you're doing and see if you need to adjust something, you know, because everything changes all the time. So you really have to also adapt, like you just told me with the corona. You're still doing education, but you're just doing it in a different way. That's probably more efficient and also easier for people to attend the classes. So maybe that was the right move anyway. But corona was the kind of thing that catalyzed the change. So yeah.
It's interesting, Tim, looking at what you're doing and how you're doing it, and also getting a bit more behind the scenes. It seems like a bit of a rare combination of both a creative and an organizer, where normally people are one or the other. So I'm definitely the creative. So the last 5-6 years, that has kind of really started to biting me. So I'm kind of learning this at an old age. So it seems like you've had some really good kind of talents from pulling, because as again the risk part of your business. I think it's you're very idealistic, but and then you go work, right, and organize.
Yeah.
And it's most often people kind of stay in one corner, or if they choose to learn the other thing, it might take, I don't know, I've given myself 10 years. That's fine, but I'm actually serious about this. It takes a lot of time to learn outside your talents. So it's great that you and that's I guess that's also why you've been able to pull this off the way you've done, that this has been so ingrained. Also hearing about how you learned this a lot working with stock splits, right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, good structure and routine and a good organization is vital in order to be able to be creative. Because if I know, like, I wouldn't be able to travel to Origin as much as I have done over the years and work with farmers directly and stuff if I didn't know that everything at home was running well. So creating good systems and structure there made me able to do what I'm supposed to do, which is to develop the business and, you know, think more creatively.
And this is really the blind spot for most entrepreneurs, and I can kind of talk about that, but that's a very well-known blind spot. So that's really impressive how.
I think you can relate to that in research as well, to be honest. Like if you start doing testing or researching, like anyone can basically do good research, but if you don't really have a plan for it, then you do not know what you're going to find, and you don't know what to look for, you don't know what method to use, and so on. So
it's a really good point, and this is often in research. It's so important to know exactly what it is you want to know, and that's also what I'm kind of the form follows function principle, that you really need to be sure what kind of outcome is relevant, and even have a plan for what do you do if the outcome is opposite. And we've done a lot of consultancy for industrial companies who funded by the marketing department, and it can work, but it's so dangerous because what we often find is no difference.
Yeah.
And if you pay 20,000 euros to get a report that tells you that there's no difference, that's awkward.
Yeah.
And this is why in our project plan, we always, under the risk, are very explicit about there's a risk of no difference between the samples, and
Mm.
particularly in sensory, that's very relevant to put in.
Mm.
So that's a good point that you have with planning, even in research, is very important. Because there's always a risk, yet you don't end up where you want to do if you don't start out thinking.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I ask you, maybe because you did the research with roast profiling, and from what I remember, you said that like if you want to modulate flavor with a certain green bean, 80% of what kind of dictated how the coffee is going to be modulated was color, and then was it like 15% the development time, something?
yes.
And you've kind of debunked all the myths when it comes to changing profiles and all these kind of things.
I don't know if you had the time. I just sent you this morning, so it's not fair to ask you here live. But did you have the time to see a bit more? Did you also see the part of my e-learning where I revealed how people at Roasting Professional are not able to
No,
distinguish? That's really really interesting data.
but
And
has it made it uncomfortable for people? Because I feel like the coffee world is really hung up on science these days. Like science is really the buzzword in the coffee industry, and everyone loves science. But do they not love science when the answers to the research is not what they want?
it's because their interest in science is driven by marketing interests.
Okay.
Right. I'm sorry to say, but but I can actually just give you. I think this is for people listening. I think this is really interesting data. So I'll just find the data from. So I've created. I did the roasting defects research in 2015 or something like that, where we took 6 different roast profiles, one extremely light, one extremely dark, a reference, which is 9 minutes to first crack, 3-minute development time to Acton 75. Boring roast, I admit, but we were interested in the differences.
Yeah.
And then we had a scorched one that was just fast on all parameters, but matched the reference in color.
Yeah.
Then we had a baked one that matched the reference in color and time to first crack, but added 4 minutes to development time. And then I coined something called underdeveloped, and there are probably 30 other correct definitions of underdeveloped, but I just wanted to be a systematic physical difference compared to the others. So I just extended time to first crack to 17 minutes and then matched the development time and color. So that's where I have these 80% from. But I can tell you, I've recreated these on the Ikawa, where I then have actually inspired by your Ikawa profile in the project we did together. I have a total roast time of 6.5 minutes for the reference, and Actron 75. And then I created the scorched one, right, the fast one, where I basically maxed out the heat capacity in it. So I drew the line that was the fastest possible I could draw that it could still follow. If I just took it a bit left or up, it couldn't follow. So I maxed out the heat completely, and that gave me a total roast time on 3.5 minutes. So I took 3 minutes off, so it's half the roast time as the reference. Then I took the baked, matched in color, and everything up to including first crack was the same, but then I added 2.5 minute development time. So the total roast time was 9 minutes.
Wow.
And then, so that's from 6.5 to 9 minutes, right? And then I took the underdeveloped, and then I added 4 minutes to first crack. So the reference had 4 minutes to first crack. So this one has 8 minutes to first crack. Double the time to first crack, and then match development time and color. And so you have to admit, these are huge differences.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then the last 3 roasting professionals I've done, in the roasting professional, you need to in triangles, you get a triangle per extreme here. So you have a triangle where you have 2 references and a scorched, another triangle, 2 references and a baked, another triangle, 2 references and an underdeveloped. and you're basically told if you can pick out the odd cup. So that's the first. And once you've picked out the odd cup, then you are asked, which one is it?
Yeah.
And before this exercise, the day before, they were calibrated on exactly these with labels, and also without labels, just for the fun of it, the day before. And then before they do this, they get 20 minutes to taste the ones with labels, and then they need to do the exercise. So this is roasting professional. It's people done the intermediate. So it's people with a lot of experience, particularly with roast profile modulation, you would expect, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, how well do they do, and which samples are they best at? So the dark one, all of them were able to pick out the dark one in all the triangles, but only 84% was able to identify it afterwards. But that's still a lot, right? And then the light, scorched, and baked, only around 75% were able to pick out in the triangle, which is also a majority, right?
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, the light, only 58% was able to say that it's the light to identify it. The scorched one, when compared to only 42%, the baked one, 37% was able to identify it. That's not a lot, 37%,
No.
2.5 minutes added.
Yeah.
And the underdeveloped, where there's double the time, 16% was able to point it out.
Oh.
That's nothing.
Yeah.
And notice here how that also, where you said 80% is color, 15% development time, and 5% is time to first crack. That's also reflected in these data, right? Because the baked one, 37% was able to identify it, and here 2.5 minutes was added to development time, where the underdeveloped, where 4 minutes was added, only 16%. So much more time was added, and much fewer were able to identify it. So and again, going back to the podcast, it's because when people do experiments, the everything else equal principle is not applied. So if you just make sure that the color is the same, then it's very small differences. And people don't make sure the color is the same, so they make a lot of assumptions about flame settings in the beginning, drum speed, airflow.
I had experience with this. I got some samples to evaluate from a person, and I was supposed to guess whether it was underdeveloped and blah blah blah. And yeah, they did taste different, but I felt like there was more to it than just different modulations in the roast profile. And then I measured the color, and they were all over the place, of course. And I've been measuring color ever since I started roasting, so I couldn't imagine roasting without it. And I know how fine of a window we have to accept whether the coffee is kind of acceptable to sell or not in our system. And I know also, because I do production cupping every Monday, I know that I can taste when it's slightly outside that window. I can start to taste slightly roastiness or slight greenness, or of course it's small details, but it's all about the details for us, at least. And then when you have really big differences in color, and the only thing you think is the difference is that you change the airflow, or that you change the flame setting in the first 2 minutes or whatever, you can end up with like extreme different color measurements, even if the development time is the same and so on. So I think, I know from experience that color is extremely important, and I cannot understand people who are still not measuring color. Fortunately, there's more people. But having said that, there's also a lot of really poor measuring devices that will give you on the same sample a lot of different numbers. So you have to make sure to have a good protocol when you prepare the samples, and also have a good measuring device. That's really important, I think.
But this is the fun thing, and this is also something I mentioned in the podcast, that people think there's a kind of discrepancy between business practices and science, and that there's a lot of surprises for people in the business when they deal with science, which is the case if there's been too much marketing kind of spin done on it, but not if you just are honest and and kind of true to what you see, and don't try to create a story all the time.
Mm.
And I've heard some other podcasts with you, because one of the things that I'm addressing in the podcast is that people tend to, if you can report something in grams per liter, or you can make a ratio, people prefer to do the ratio because it sounds smarter, right?
Yeah.
If you've got time and temperature, you tend to want to express everything in the rate of rise because it sounds more fancy, but really it's not a physical entity.
No.
Time and temperature is a physical entity. Calculated value is a derived value, which make it not more fundamental, but as actually a bit more superficial. It's not wrong.
Yeah.
It's just not. And I've noticed what you in a podcast I heard when you talked about when you transitioned from the probat to the lowering, you just referred to, well, it was, we experiment with different phases to add the energy. And if you just stay with the basic physical entities and not try to regress into a lot of things, that's actually the scientific approach. And that's also where you're not kind of digressing into a lot of things that makes everybody confused. So in that sense, you're kind of also a bit, a natural scientist, in the sense that you're trying to stay at the fundamentals rather than digress into a lot of fluffy parameters. So, and that's also why when we've done research together, we've never had, Tim, I'll tell you how, because we've never really been into any kind of these things where you kind of assumed a lot of things and wanted to say stuff that was just a great story, but not really what it was about. So I think that's a very important intuition to have as a person in the business practices, but also as a scientist.
Yeah.
So this is where I see some bridges. And also, as I mentioned, I also done project with Rob Hoos, and he's also very kind of just simple in the good way, simple in the way of how concepts are correctly used.
I mean, for me, it's actually about in our company we have now 3 people who can roast coffee, actually 4, but one is on paternity leave. But and I'm the one doing the quality control, which means the tasting, and I also evaluate the curves, and because I buy the coffee, so I kind of know them quite well. I know what to expect from them when I taste. But for me, it's always been extremely important to simplify the roasting process so that more people can replicate the same thing. Because what happens if you're relying on one person to roast and he disappears or she disappears? The customer should not notice who is roasting the coffee. And that's the same thing we have with the espresso. When we make coffee in the espresso bar, the customer shouldn't be relying on one person to get the best coffee. Everyone should be able to make the same coffee. So that's why we try to really simplify the process of making it so that everyone can replicate it. And if you look at our roast profiles now, to be honest, they look very, very similar regardless of coffee. And the only kind of thing we change is the amount of energy input we use based on moisture content in the coffee. We always have the same batch size. And then when you start laying the curves on top of each other in Cropster, they look almost identical, regardless of coffee.
And also, people always, how to roast this, how to roast that. Well, how do you want it to taste, right?
Yeah.
And the differences are more. I don't know if also I have this pyramid of hierarchy. The importance of the parameters. The base is the green, right? That's always the most important. So why would you even roast them differently if they are different already on the green level? And of course, there can be different reasons to roast it differently, but there can also be reasons not to do it.
Yeah, we actually just almost let the curve happen by itself. So we start with the energy input, and then it's quite easy to see once you've looked at many curves if you're pushing it too fast or if you're way too slow. For instance, we have kind of a time frame where we like to be within based on the preference of how I want the coffees to taste like, but it doesn't mean that it's the only right time frame. Let's say my total roast time is normally around 10 to 11 minutes, but it doesn't mean that that's correct for every roaster. Some people like it in a different style. They might prefer 12 to 15 minutes for all I care. I don't really care. So I think we're putting too much into it.
but I'm not saying the roast profiling isn't relevant. You still have the 20%, right? Color is only 80%, so 20 is quite a lot. And even the 5%, I can taste. People can taste it, right? You can
Yeah.
squeeze the last juiciness out of something by pushing first crack a bit earlier. So I'm not saying it's not perceivable, but people just don't have the proportion of kind of it's so important to have priority for parameters. Otherwise, you are all over the place with things, right? And
Yeah.
this is really what I hope that our research can help people kind of get some proportion intuition, right?
Yeah.
But having good green coffees, you don't you're really good off for making amazing coffees. And this is also where I think your concept is. This is something you just knew from the beginning, right? Because that has been your focus all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it started with we did a lot of experiments with our roaster in the beginning, and then I realized that whatever we did, the coffee didn't taste better.
Yeah, tasted
And
different, but not better.
yeah, and I remember the coffee as tasting better when I bought it, but of course, when it landed, it was woody and so on. So that's why I started traveling to origin, and really to do the quality control at farm level with the farmers it makes roasting a lot easier, because I know what to expect when the coffee arrives. A lot of the coffees we buy year after year, and they're very easy to roast. Like, it's so easy to make small mistakes with the roaster and still have the coffee taste great. So you get away with a lot more if you buy high quality coffee, of course. But I think it's also about the standard you want to set. Like I feel like we have a very tight window of a standard where we want our coffee to be, and we don't sell it as our branded coffee if it's not within that window. But a lot of roasters, they don't want to waste coffee or anything, so they will sell, even if maybe they forgot to take the coffee out 30 seconds later than they wanted to, then it became a little bit darker. They don't want to throw it out, so they still sell it. And that's where you get more of the discrepancies, inconsistency, at least because of human error, I think. And of course the machine setup can also be a little can be important as well. But if you're working with like a modern coffee roasting machine, they're normally quite consistent as well.
Yeah. So that's much fewer people which roaster to buy. Well, actually, any of the brands with some reputation, you would be able to make amazing coffee. It's just about getting the right greens and then do a bit of experiments. It's not it's not that difficult.
No, it's kind of like saying what espresso machine did you buy. It's not going to make it's not going to change the espresso from terrible to fantastic if you just change the espresso machine. It's how you use the machine that's important.
And I think in the education system, it's so important for people to get some sense of proportion of relevance of all the questions. People love all the questions and people love to overcomplicate them. It's actually not that difficult. And it's so important in the education that I feel that we are pushing that agenda, because otherwise we are just weakening ourselves as a community, chasing ghosts, right? And and so, Jim, when it comes to my podcast, people who haven't heard it might not perhaps get a sense of how much of a rant it is against a lot of the most common education practices. So how did you kind of perceive that part of it?
No, you can definitely sense that you're a little frustrated, for sure. But there's two ways to be frustrated. One is to just be frustrated and complain. Another way is to come with constructive feedback on how it can be changed for the better. And I think you do that a lot in the podcast, like a lot of constructive feedback on how methods should be changed. You're mentioning the SEA score sheet, which is a score sheet that I use a lot, but I use it for two different purposes. And for one purpose, it actually is not very right. So I'm thinking of how changing my method there. But like you're always saying, form follows function. I think we are a little bit stuck in our routines in the coffee industry, and it's a young industry, and a lot of the kind of knowledge we have had and still have is based on people telling one another. Like a lot of my knowledge I got from traveling around, talking to people, asking people, learning from other people. And maybe what they're saying is actually not right, but I'm still learning, and they can reason why they believe it's right, but it might not be the correct thing. And I think revising the educational material that we're sitting on in the coffee world, especially in organizations that are, making a lot of money on educating people, and also revising the methods they're using to kind of qualify people to become, for instance, a Q grader or something like that, and taking a more pragmatic way of doing it. I think it's better. I took the Q grader class some years ago, and I passed. But one of the tests we had to do was the sweet, salt, and acidity in different solutions. And to this day, I don't know how I passed that. Like, it's easy to identify the intensities when you drink them alone. Like if it's more or less salt, if it's more or less acidic, that's easy to identify, I think. But once you start mixing them, I know for a fact that if you drink lemonade, it's sour as hell if it's only lemon and water. But if you add sugar to it, you don't perceive the acidity in the same way. So this really changes the perception of the acidity level. So I couldn't understand why they were using these tests in order to qualify people. And it almost felt like it was designed to fail 70% of the people, and a random 30% would pass.
Yeah.
And I'd taken that test many times and never passed it, but on the Q grader I passed it for some obscure reason, and I had no idea. So I feel like we should really ask ourselves questions when we do things like this that people pay a lot of money for. And if they don't pass, they have to travel to another country, maybe to retake the test. That's a lot more money. We have to really ask ourselves, is it fair? Is it a fair method to test people or not?
Yeah, and I think again the SCA cupping form, if you have found a way you do it internally in the company, that's not wrong. Again, form follows function. The function is that you have an internal way of talking about it, but don't expect somebody else in the neighbor company using the same form to come up with the same data. And that's my criticism. It's not a parameter estimate of a true value in the coffee. It's an interpretation, which is okay, but then call it a consumer method where you are your own consumer if you have a preference, and that's perfect. You can easily do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But form follows function is wrong here. If people think that there's a universal, it's like there's one mountain that everybody in the world is trying to kind of climb, and the scoring is the altitude. That's not the case. There are different mountains, and that's where it's if you have a map where there's only one mountain, but in the world there are 100 mountains, then the map is bad. You can't use it. And even if you climb a mountain and somebody else climbed a mountain, we got the same place. Well, no, it didn't look like that on my place, and then all this confusion starts to happen, right? So it's really that's really it's the waste of time that really annoys me. And it's the weakness of the community as a consequence that really annoys me. Why would we support things that makes us weak as a community? Why would we accept it?
I think it's just there's not that many alternatives in our community. There's not like you can't really take a master's degree in barista or a master's degree in roasting. I guess you probably can, but there's no universities really offering coffee education except the Ili University in Trieste, I think. So it has kind of worked for SCA. They're bringing in money, and it is to some extent educating people, I would say. I have learned a lot at SCA. I took one of the classes that I really enjoyed was the green coffee defect class that I took many years ago, just to be able to identify the defects. But that class was really simply set up. It was clean coffee, and then you had a cup next to it with a phenolic cup, for instance. So it was so easy to taste the defect. And they had the same with ferment, and they had the same with woody coffee, and so on. And that's a really easy way to educate people. But some of the other classes I have been a little bit frustrated about, of course. I remember taking a barista class in Miami in 2002, and together with my barista master Willie Hansen, and we ended up actually teaching the instructor how to make espresso. So it is a work in progress, I think, and they are. It is a high value, I think, in our marketplace to have an organization that is focusing on education. But it doesn't mean it can't be improved, and it should be revised, I think, almost every year, because there's new knowledge coming in and so on.
And I think that's also my point, right? We still do SCA roasting and sensory courses and do them. But I think it's also just my podcast is kind of, let's go already, right? The principles, it's really simple. The principles for a good education is to distinguish between intensities and qualities, and understand the qualities as a preference thing where you can have different opinions. That distinction in itself is enough to kind of, for all the consequences I'm rolling out in the podcast. And this idea is, I think, in the 70s, that sensory and consumer science, I am not completely, I think it was Pangborn actually at UC Davis, who came up with this distinction and methods, corresponding methods to execute correct sensory projects with that fundamental distinction. And then I'm just thinking, okay, now SCA has been working with UC Davis and Zurich, and also Copenhagen. I've also been very much part of this. And I think now it's time to take this discussion, right? So we can move on as a community and not hang on old principles that has been too old for 50 years already.
I think, in general, it's easy to take things personal when things are criticized, because obviously there's people doing these trainings and courses, but instead of being offended personally, one should look at, maybe we can improve it and take the criticism and maybe grow on that. And I think I've always been perceived as being a little bit blunt by other people, and I think it's just the way, it's a little bit the Norwegian culture that we are quite direct people. But also, for instance, I have an example. I went to the US many years ago and visited a coffee roastery, and we did a cupping together, and then they asked me my opinion about the coffees, and I told them my opinion, and they were furious, I didn't like the coffees, and I was just being honest about it. But instead of asking themselves, why didn't they like the coffee, or maybe there's something we can improve, they just ended up hating me and didn't want to have anything to do with me ever since. So my question is, why did you ask my opinion if you didn't want it? Of course, in the later years, I've learned to be a little bit more elegant about it. That's when people ask, how are you, for instance, they don't necessarily expect to have an honest answer. But I think there's a lot to learn from criticism, and we shouldn't just go around and pat our backs and telling ourselves that we're great all the time, because we don't grow as a community by doing that.
Or people, right?
Yeah,
it's such an important thing, and that's also very scientific. If you know about in scientific publication cultures, people are really trying to disprove each other, which is a huge support. This is how you grow as a community. So it's very normal in science to be extremely direct, because if you're not, truth is at stake, right? We might be wrong, and that's the worst thing that can happen. So it's actually very scientific. And again, your approach to honesty, that's very scientific, because that's how science is improving. People are not patting each other on the backs, and that's also the spirit that I wanted to kind of, we are pursuing the truth here, right? For the sake of a community that is wasting time. So that's the seriousness, and then our egos can't get in the way of that much more important process. And this is also where I really hope that and this is also now we are some of the older people in this community, and that's also why I appreciate so much that you are willing to take time out to take these discussions, because people are kind of looking to somebody like us to kind of grow. And I think it's time that the people who has been it for many years in the community with a lot of experience and knowledge, that we are also able to talk together and kind of expose each other's blind spots, so that the community can grow. So Rob and I, we did the research some years, and Rob had a hypothesis that wasn't disproven, but it wasn't really proven to the extent that we hoped. And I had a hypothesis that wasn't proven, but we did this work together, and
Yeah.
we accepted the outcome because we did it together and we wanted to know together.
Mm.
So I really hope that to do more like that research with Rob and you and other people in the community who kind of are able to break it out the egos to have to serve the community by just finding out what's important, how can we do it, and so on. That to have that as the focus. So I actually have some plans also with you, Tim, that I haven't told about you about yet, but I'll do that
Excellent.
offline later. So okay, but Tim, we are about halfway into the podcast now. So no, no, we could talk forever, and
Yeah,
and
for
that
sure.
doesn't work. But is there anything that you wanted to say that you haven't said yet?
I think maybe one thing that we can end on that I always remind myself is that I view coffee as a system. It's a system of many different things. It's kind of like a engine in a car. It consists of a carburetor, the engine itself, a battery, air filter, all these kind of things. And Formula One teams or car teams, they know if they change one part, the performance of the car might be very different. Or if they tweak one part of the engine, you might get more horsepower or less or something like that. It's the same with coffee. Like we use a certain grinder, we use a certain machine, we have a certain water filter, certain pressure, certain temperature, certain green coffee, certain roaster. Once I kind of change one thing in that chain of in my system, I might have to adjust my roasting or something to make the flavor that I want. And it's quite easy, especially if you work with espresso, to see that just by changing the grinder, you might have to change your whole brewing recipe if you want to end up with the same extraction, for instance. So being very clear on what you want and how to measure what you want, that you achieve what you want, is quite important, I think. And also not stop looking for this kind of silver bullet or the holy grail, because you're never going to find it. There's so many ways to achieve the same goal. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out how am I tweaking this system to achieve the goal, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I completely agree. Can I add something?
Yeah.
Which is, a skilled engineer would also know the magnitude of influence of the different, and that's very important. For example, if you are in a pit stop and a screw has been broken, then you find another one, and you can have two types of engineers. One saying, no, it's not the original, we can't use it. Or another one, well, it's the same kind of let's just use it because practically it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
So because it in your metaphor, it could be a bit tempting to think that, okay, we've got 1,000 parameters, they are all equally important, and we change one, everything changes.
Yeah.
And I think I completely agree with your metaphor, but I also think it's important to have this sense of magnitude. Given the goal I have, what's important and what is not important.
Yeah, so just to take espresso, for instance, we measure extraction, and I know with the grinder that I have, like, let's say I want to have 21% extraction or as high as possible, actually, to get the best possible espresso. But if I use an old La Marzocco Linea, for instance, the brewing pressure on that machine might have to be slightly around 5 bars of pressure, because the flow rate of the water is so high on an old Linea. But if you put a jiggler in, or if you have a new La Marzocco, the pressure might be 8 or 9 bars to achieve the same goal. And this is what I'm talking about. It's always a system. So you kind of just need to measure where do you actually want to be and how to achieve that. That's the only easy way to work, I think.
Yeah, and this is also, if I might sneak in, our or any flavor wheel, really, it doesn't have to be ours, but just have a specific picture of where you want to go from a flavor perspective, and then reverse engineer from there. Where people, how to do this, how to roast Ethiopian, how to brew Ethiopian, they want you to tell them. Where it's no, you need to trust your own sensory skills, and then you need to have a flavor objective, and then you reverse engineer.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect way of explaining it. And by the way, the new flavor wheel is fantastic. I've just got a poster that's in my lab already.
I saw that on Instagram. Tim, I need to send you a frame. It looked like, don't you know the pants that are not long enough so you can see too much of the socks?
Yeah.
That's the frame you found. I have some that fits.
That's all right.
It looks nice. No worries. Okay.
Cool.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for taking your time. And I must say, since you have such a strict business plan that you made in 2006, I'm really grateful that being part of my podcast was part of it, so that you took your time out to discuss this. So I'm really grateful for that. And I can promise you that I will reach out with the research projects and other podcasts and discussion stuff. I'm sure that everybody listening here is also really grateful that you took out time to participate.
It's always a pleasure.
All right, but thank you so much, Tim, and good luck with your amazing high-risk business plan.
Thank you, Morten. Have a great Easter.
Same to you. Bye.
Ciao.